Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this program, The Origin and Evolution of Whales or Cetaceans. My name is Laurel. I'm part of the Deschutes Public Library Community Relations team, and every month we explore a theme in our programming, and this month's theme is origins. You can find more free library programming on our event calendar at deschuteslibrary.org/calendar, or you can find recordings of programs like this one on our YouTube channel. If you in the audience have questions that come up during the program, and I really hope you do, you can put them in the Q&A in the chat just throughout the program, and we'll have our presenter answer them at the end. Our presenter is Dr. Lisa Ballance, the director of Oregon State University's Marine Mammal Institute. She's the Endowed Chair of Marine Mammal Research and Professor of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Sciences. She studied the ecology and conservation biology of whales, dolphins, and porpoises, and seabirds for over 30 years around the world. She holds a PhD in marine ecology, an MS in marine science, and a BS in biology. And that is just a brief summarization of Dr. Ballance's impressive resume. Dr. Ballance, we are delighted to have you. Thank you for telling us about the amazing story of cetaceans' evolution and origins.
Thank you very much, Laurel. And I will begin with a quick check that my screen is visible to all here.
Looks good.
And hello to all of you out there. I am thrilled to be here and thrilled to talk about this subject, one of my absolute favorite topics associated with cetaceans, the origin and evolution of cetaceans. Cetaceans are whales, dolphins, and porpoises, as I'll explain a little bit more in a moment. They're found in all oceans of the world, from the ice edge in Antarctica to the ice edge in the Arctic. They're found in the shallowest of coastal bays, even in some freshwater rivers, to the most remote oceanic regions, from the surface of the ocean to the bottom of the sea. They're among the most recognizable of all marine animals, yet many of us are completely unaware that this charismatic group of large-bodied mammals evolved from terrestrial ancestors. Yes, indeed. And in the next hour, I'm going to tell you the fascinating story of the origin and evolution of cetaceans, as evidenced by the fossil record and artistic impressions of these cetacean ancestors. Prepare to be amazed. I'm going to begin my presentation with some background information. And in particular, there are 5 concepts that will be very helpful to understand basically before we go into the story of cetacean evolution. Now, the first one of those is the most obvious, just to be sure that we all know what are cetaceans. Cetaceans, as I said a moment ago, are whales, dolphins, and porpoises. And they are abundant in terms of number of species and quite diverse. There are 14 families and 93 species that are currently recognized, with that number increasing from the low 70s a few decades ago, largely due to the advent of molecular genetics and the ability to distinguish different species from one another. As I said, they're a very diverse group of animals. They range in size from the tiny vaquita, a little porpoise that is endemic just to the northern Gulf of California in Mexico, at about 1.3 meters or 4 feet in length, to the largest animal ever to have lived on the planet, the blue whale, up to 33.5 meters, according to whalers that took the largest animals. That's about 110 feet long. I mentioned earlier that they're found in all oceans of the world, from ice edge to ice edge, and even in freshwater rivers. And here are some photographs of some of the cetaceans A number of them will be quite familiar to you. The common dolphin here, the killer whale, of course, and some are a little bit less familiar, although everyone is probably aware of the narwhal, the unicorn of the sea. This is an Irrawaddy dolphin found in coastal waters of Southeast Asia and some freshwater rivers. This is a beaked whale, an entire family of whales that is found in oceanic regions and can dive up to an hour and a half at a time. And I want to be sure that I start my presentation with the punchline, because it is such an extraordinary fact that cetaceans evolved from terrestrial ancestors. And in this next hour, I'm going to tell you about how this eastern spinner dolphin basically is derived from this terrestrial mammal. So the second piece of background information that's helpful to know is, how do we study cetacean evolution? And these next two slides are going to be a little bit dense in terms of terminology. I'll ask your forgiveness up front, but I'll walk you through them, and the basics are important for understanding the rest of the presentation. So typically we reconstruct evolutionary history based on things known as characters. Characters are heritable traits, and they can be essentially anything that is heritable. The familiar heritable traits that we all think of tend to be anatomical and physiological features, but they can also be behavioral traits and, of course, DNA pairs. So we study these characters, and for cetaceans, skeletal morphology, DNA, and increasingly behavior, particularly acoustic calls, are important in reconstructing their evolutionary history. All characters evolve from what we call ancestral to derived, ancient to current. And we look for shared derived characters as evidence of common ancestry. And let me give you just a very simple, familiar example of that. These are the bones of the pectoral limbs of tetrapods. And here you see the forelimbs of a whale, a frog, a horse, a lion, a human, a bat, and a bird. And although the size, shape, and placement of those bones is quite dramatically different between these groups, all of those bones evolved from a common ancestor. That's what we mean when we talk about shared derived characters. And so we know that this suite of characters ties this group together as a single group known as tetrapods. The second thing I want to mention about studying evolutionary history is that evolutionary histories and relationships are represented by what we call cladograms. And this is a cladogram of the vertebrates, a partial evolutionary tree of the vertebrates. I'm going to walk you through this because I'm going to show a number of cladograms later on in the presentation, and I want you to be able to understand how to interpret them. The ancestral lineage is down in the lower left, and as you move upward to the right, that becomes a representation of time, from early time to most recent. These lines that are coming off of that ancestral line represent speciation events, and each of the lines is what we refer to as a lineage. So this first one is the actinopterygians, the fishes, and the second one, for example, is amphibians. Okay, the third important concept that is helpful to understand is that evolutionary history is represented in terms of the geologic time scale. And this is quite familiar to all of you, I'm sure. This is the entire geologic time scale of the Earth. Some of these names are going to be familiar to you, some perhaps not. These names come from locations of rocks corresponding to that age. ancient peoples living in the area corresponding to the rocks of that age, and derivations of time. And we break the geologic timescale into super eon, eon, era, and period here. So in this time scale, the age of the Earth is estimated at 4.5 billion years. And the first life is thought to have evolved between 3.5 and 4 billion years. Now, the evolution of cetaceans is condensed into the far right-hand corner of this scale. So let's expand the Phanerozoic eon and take a little bit closer look at the eras and periods there. And here we see some also important milestones, including the appearance of the first fishes in the Cambrian period and the age of dinosaurs in the Mesozoic era. But still, the evolution of cetaceans is compressed into the far right-hand side of this time scale. So finally, let's blow up the Cenozoic era and take a look at the periods and epochs there. And here we see the evolution of cetaceans in the three epochs of the Eocene, the Oligocene, and the Miocene, from about 35 million years ago to about 60 million years ago. This is where our story will take place. The fourth concept that's helpful to understand is that the continents change shape and size and move around our planet due to what is known as seafloor spreading. This representation of the modern world shows the continents as they are today. It's very familiar to all of us. But the continents did not always look like this, and they were not always placed where they are today. In fact, in the early Triassic, 237 million years ago, this is what the continents looked like. Very, very different from what they look like now. And the movement of these continents played a very important role in the evolution of cetaceans. And because of that, I am going to show you now a brief 2-minute animation of continental drift as driven by seafloor spreading. And what you see here is a representation of the continents about 240 million years ago. I'm going to start this animation. And as the time moves forward, you can see the change in the how many years ago that representation is. And on the upper left, the various names of the time periods in the geologic scale. So I'm going to run this from now 170 million years ago to modern times. And I'm not going to talk further because it's a magical experience to watch this continental drift through time, and it's nice music in the background. Be back with you in a minute and a half. Okay, so I encourage any of you who are interested to watch this entire video, because not only does it reconstruct past history, it projects the movement of the continents forward in time to 250 million years from today. Fascinating stuff. And meanwhile, let me move on to the fifth piece of background information that is helpful to understand before we begin our story. And that is that global temperature changes through time. And here what you see is a time representation in terms of millions of years ago, from 500 million years ago to today, and the average global temperature. The red lines represent temperatures during time in this planet without any polar ice caps. And the blue temperatures represent times that the world had polar ice caps. And so you can see a couple of things immediately. The temperature globally, when we average it, has changed quite a bit through time. And we also have lived through times without polar ice caps as well as with. Relevant to our story here, the time period inside this box is when cetacean evolution occurred. And so it's interesting and instructive to understand that the world was quite a bit warmer during cetacean evolution, largely without polar ice caps, than it is today. So with that background out of the way, let me move forward and tell you the absolutely fascinating story of the evolution of cetaceans. And I'm going to start with this phylogeny of mammals. And the phylogeny is essentially representing the evolutionary relationships. What you will see here are the names of the major groups of mammals. And many of them are going to be familiar to you. In the middle here, mice and rats, beavers, chipmunks, rabbits. The proximity of these groups to each other represents the fact that they are closely evolutionarily related. And then the farther away these groups are from one another, that is an indication that they are distantly related. For example, mice and rats versus aardvarks. There are three groups here that are marine mammal groups. Seals, sea lions, sea otters, and polar bears come from the carnivore group. And manatees and dugongs come from the group that includes manatees, elephants, and hyraxes. But of course, today we are here to talk about cetaceans. And cetaceans come from the group with the very technologically sounding term, Cetaceans. So let's take a little bit closer look at that group. This is a phylogeny of Cetaceans, the cetaceans. And again, remember that the phylogeny just is a representation of evolutionary relationships. So please ignore the cryptic looking numbers here and the mysterious names that you're not familiar with. I'll walk you through what's important in this slide, starting with the fact that there are some recognizable groups here. The Cervidae include deer, elk, moose, and caribou, and they are very closely related to the giraffe and okapi because they're next to each other in this phylogenetic tree. These two together are relatively closely related to the bovidae, the bison, buffalo, antelope, gazelle, sheep, and goat. So this can tell you how closely related these animals and groups are. The names of these groups in the red circles are all cetaceans, the baleen whales, sperm whales, beaked whales, and dolphins. And so One thing that is obvious here is that all of the cetaceans evolved from a common ancestor because they all can be linked just to one branch back in the evolutionary tree. We refer to this group as being monophyletic. The other really interesting thing to me about this phylogeny is that the closest relative to the cetaceans are the hippopotami. I'll come back to that a little bit later in the talk. Now, the evolution of cetaceans is revealed through the fossil record, and specifically through the fossil record of a group of cetaceans known as archaeocetes. Archaeocetes, that term is derived from Latin, literally meaning ancient whales. All of these archaeocetes are extinct now, but we do have a fossil record, in some cases quite a rich fossil record of these archaeocetes, and they tell a fascinating story. This is a cladogram of the archaeocetes, and again, remember that the earliest time is far over to the left, with time moving forward to the right, and these lines coming off of the basal line are lineages. And the earliest one here being Pachycetidae, and the later one being Basilosauridae. So again, all of these archaeocete lineages are extinct, but this one lineage gave rise to modern day cetaceans, the baleen whales and the toothed whales, and I'll get to that in about 15 minutes. Meanwhile, what I'd really like to do is walk you through each of these lineages and tell you a little bit about them. And once again, all of these lineages evolved and developed during the Cenozoic era, and particularly in the Eocene epoch, about 30 and bleeding into the Oligocene, about 35 million years ago, reaching back to as long as 60 million years ago. So let's start at the beginning of the cetacean evolution story in the early Eocene, 50 to 60 million years ago. Very important in cetacean evolution is the Tethys Sea, this area that is surrounded by the red circle. The Tethys Sea was a gigantic inland body of water, largely fresh, largely shallow, quite productive. And it was very important in the first beginnings of cetaceans, as well as in their radiation subsequently. About this time, we had animals in this family, Pachycetidae, roaming the coastal areas around the Tethys Sea. They were fox or wolf-sized animals, and they were predominantly terrestrial. That's quite obvious from this artistic representation of Pachycetidae. It's a four-limbed animal, clearly very well suited for walking around on land, long tail, maybe for balance, ears, couple of eyes used for vision, a nose, nothing really extraordinary there. But what is very interesting about this animal and what links it to modern day cetaceans is that they were partially aquatic. We know this because fossils of this animal come from modern day Pakistan, but that was near the coastal Tethys Sea, but particularly and explicitly because in fossilized skulls, the ear bones of these animals were adapted for underwater hearing. So now let's move into the Middle Eocene, 45 million years ago, when the continents looked like this. And at this time, the Tethys Sea was continuing to enlarge because all of the continents, due to seafloor spreading, were moving away from each other. So this did two things. First, it increased the size of the Tethys Sea, which continued to be relatively shallow and quite productive. But the other thing it did was it started to open access from the Tethys Sea into the deeper oceans. And both of those events were extremely important in the radiation of these early cetaceans into a number of additional lineages. And the 5 additional lineages of archaeocetes all date back to about this time. The earliest of those lineages was a group of animals known as Ambulocetidae. And this is an artistic representation of one genus in that family, Ambulocetus, based on a very complete skeleton that has skeletons that have been found. Now, like this artistic representation, these are monsters. They were big animals, 3 meters long, 300 kilograms heavy, very thick limbs. They were amphibious. Their back legs were more adapted to swimming or pushing themselves off the bottom than to walking. We know this because of the articulation of the back limb with the pelvic girdle indicates that that back limb was typically found behind the animal instead of underneath. They lived in shallow, swampy, both marine and freshwater environments, and they were predatory based on the long rostrum, the heavy skull, and the numerous sharp pointy teeth. We think that they had an ecological niche similar to today's crocodiles. Importantly for our story, they had a number of cetacean-like features, including the teeth, ear bones, also adapted for underwater swimming, and their nose adapted for underwater swallowing. Finally, they had no external ears. And they represent an interesting transition between life on land and life in the water, and between life in freshwater and life in marine waters. The next lineage to appear during this time was Remingtonocetidae. These, like the previous lineage, were also amphibious. They lived in coastal marine environments. And as you can see from the skeleton below here and the artistic depiction of that, of one of those animals, Cuchacetus, above, they had long, narrow skulls and long jaws. Long jaws in general, especially in a marine form, is an indication that they eat a diet of fast swimming prey. Additionally, they had small orbits, and that's an indication that vision is not particularly important. That's interesting because many marine forms have less reliance on vision than other senses, simply because light penetration in the water is not as far as it is in the air. And finally, these animals also had ears that were adapted for underwater hearing. The next lineage to appear during this time was Protocetidae. And here are a couple of artistic depictions of 2 genera, Rhodocetus and Protocetus, that existed during this time. Animals in this family were very widespread. Fossils have been found from Europe, Africa, Asia, and North America. And these were the first archaeocetes to disperse to all of the shallow subtropical oceans. There were lagoon, coastal, and importantly, open water marine forms. They had large nasal openings, and their nostrils were not at the end of the snout, but they were beginning to move up towards the top of the head, halfway up the snout. And indeed, some of them were possibly had flukes. The fluke is this, the tail of whales and dolphins that we know so well, that you can see here in Protocetus. Another thing I'll draw your attention to is some of these animals still had very well-developed hind limbs like Rhodocetus, but others had hind limbs that were starting to become smaller. I'll talk more about that in a moment. The next lineage to appear during this time was Basilosauridae. These were extremely large animals ranging from 12 to 25 meters. That's about more than 75 feet long. In fact, they were initially mistaken for marine reptiles, and you can see why when you look at that skeleton at the bottom of the screen there. Basilosaurids were obligate marine forms, no freshwater forms. So they were truly moving into the world's oceans. They were very widely distributed throughout the tropic and subtropical oceans. The size of the skull indicates that they had relatively small brains. That's an indication that they were probably not particularly social. They did have a tail with a fluke, but the degree to which that was responsible for propulsion through the water is unclear. And there have been fish remains found with the fossils. Importantly, basilosaurids were fully recognizable cetaceans. Their nostrils were close to the position of modern day whale blowholes on the top of the head. They had functionally modern cetacean ears, and they had tiny external hind limbs that you can see in this artistic rendition, very tiny, but their pelvic bones were no longer connected to the vertebral column. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And the final lineage of archaeocetes to appear during this time was Dorudontidae. Dorudontidae were very similar to Basilosauridae, the previous lineage that I just described, with a couple of notable exceptions. They were dolphin-like, a lot smaller, about 5 meters in length, and they had tails with flukes that absolutely did form the main propulsive organ. And we know that based on skeletal structure of the spine, especially in the back end of the animal, where there was a large muscle mass that was needed to move that tail up and down through dense water. It was the Dorudontidae that gave rise almost certainly to modern cetaceans. So this is an extremely important lineage in our story. All right, subsequently, we get into the Oligocene about 35 million years ago. And this is what the continents looked like during that time period. I've drawn some red circles around the geographic areas where we have found rich fossil beds of ancestral cetaceans. So you can see quite widespread at that time. This is a phylogeny of modern cetaceans. And again, phylogeny is a representation of evolutionary relationships. The names here are going to be likely quite unfamiliar to you, but there are a couple of important characteristics that I want to point out associated with this phylogeny. The first is that it was at 35 million years ago when the two types of modern cetaceans diverged from one another. The baleen whales, also referred to as mysticetes, and the toothed whales, which are known as odontocetes. And so the four groups on the top here are families of baleen whales, and the remaining groups at the bottom of this phylogeny are families of toothed whales. And the second thing I want to point out that this phylogeny makes quite clear is that baleen whales and toothed whales are each monophyletic. In other words, each of those groups are derived from a single common ancestor. And we know that because taking a look at these four families of baleen whales at the top, this phylogenetic tree can trace all of that group back to a single lineage. And similarly with all of the families below of the toothed whales, they are all traced back to a single lineage. So fascinating story. I am not going to go into the evolution of modern day cetaceans today. It is equally fascinating, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. So I want to summarize that story of evolution that we just saw through the fossil history in terms of 4 themes. Woven through the progression of cetacean evolution are 4 major changes in skeletal and tooth morphology that I'll walk you through now. I don't have time to walk you through a bunch of other fascinating physiological and behavioral changes that are associated with cetacean evolution. I'll save that as well for next time. The first of those 4 major changes are reduction of the hind limbs. And so here again is that cladogram of the archaeocetes, and you'll now recognize some of these names, the lineage Pachycetidae, Ambulocetidae, Remingtonocetidae, etc. And what, if you recall back from the slides that we just reviewed, Ambulocetidae, that crocodilian-like predatory animal, had a relatively fully developed hind limbs with all of the recognizable bones that we have in modern day tetrapods today. But as we progress along through that evolution with these lineages, the hind limbs became progressively smaller and smaller until in modern day cetaceans, the hind limbs have disappeared altogether. There are no hind limbs. And in fact, there's only a tiny remnant of hind limbs. And that is a vestigial pelvic girdle, which is a single free-floating bone that is embedded in the abdominal cavity. In a bottlenose dolphin, this is a bone the size of your index finger that again is just embedded in the abdominal cavity. That's all that's left of the hind limbs. The adaptive significance of this is clear. When they moved from land into the water, these ancient cetaceans no longer needed their hind limbs to support them walking around on land. And in fact, those hind limbs became problematic because moving around in water, which is a much more dense medium than air, they offer resistance to movement. So it's the reduction of the hind limbs, and ultimately the loss of the hind limbs provides greater hydrodynamic efficiency for locomotion in water. The second of these major changes is shortening and flattening of the pectoral long bones, the bones associated with the forelimb. And let me walk you through this. This is the forelimb of a greyhound, and the long bones are the humerus, this one up near the top, and the radius and ulna. You can see that they are long and relatively large, strong bones. Of course, they need to be that way to support the weight of the animal as it walks or runs on land. These are the forelimbs of modern day cetaceans, a sperm whale in the middle and the dolphin on the right. And you can see how different are the shapes of the humerus and the radius and ulna in the sperm whale and in the dolphin. They are much shorter and they've been compressed or flattened. A second associated change is an increased number of bones in the digits, which we refer to as hyperphalangy. The digits of an animal are essentially the fingers. And you can see that in this sperm whale, the number of bones in these digits has been increased relative to terrestrial forms. In the dolphin, this has reached an extreme number of bones in the digit. The adaptive significance of these changes underscores the importance of the forelimbs for locomotion in the water for modern day cetaceans, but their different function. So as land animals, we need our forelimbs also to support us in the ancient cetaceans for walking around on land. But moving into water, the forelimbs become important not for supporting the body against gravity, but for steering the animal through the dense medium that is water. And so these forelimbs have been modified to function more as rudders, or think of a paddle to steer and direct the animal as it moves through the water. The third major change is changes in the size, shape, and placement of the bones of the skull of these. And we refer to this as telescoping. There are 6 bones of the skull that are particularly important here. I'm not going to go through their names. That's not important here. But what is the changes. The upper skull here is the skull of an Archaeocete Basilosaurus, and the different bones have different coloring and stippling to allow you to see where they are placed in the skull. This is the skull of similar to any terrestrial mammal. The bottom skull is the skull of an odontocete, a toothed whale, in this case, a common dolphin. And those and shape and size. The adaptive significance here is to evolutionarily change the skull shape and size to push the nostrils, the nares, on top of the head so that the animal in water does not have to lift its head out of the water to breathe. It can just simply come up to the surface and breathe through the blowhole, as you all know whales and dolphins do. And finally, the fourth major change has to do with homodonty and polydonty. Those are terms that mean homodont is similar, dont is teeth, teeth of the same type, and polydonty just means an increase in tooth number. So the top skull here is the skull of a bottlenose dolphin, and you can see that the teeth are not differentiated. Instead, they are all the same shape and size. And that's characteristic of modern day cetaceans. It also has a greater number of teeth than typical terrestrial mammals. So both of these things are important when you are capturing fast moving and powerful prey. And this is clear when we look at the 3 skulls in the lower right here. These are skulls of other marine forms, crocodilians, for example, that catch fast-moving, powerful prey. And this is actually even important when you are a terrestrial animal that preys on fast-moving and powerful prey, as we have seen in the skulls and the teeth of some predatory dinosaurs. So I am going to close my talk with a video that compresses this entire story into 3 minutes. And that video begins with this question: fact or fiction? Dolphins and whales once had legs and lived on land. the evolution of marine mammals is one of my favorite subjects. It is so fascinating. But marine mammals are called secondary marine forms. A secondary marine form is one that came out on land and then moved back into the marine environment. So all marine mammals are secondary marine forms. All seabirds, all marine reptiles came from terrestrial ancestors that moved back. And in the case of marine mammals, the closest living relative to cetaceans, whales, dolphins, and porpoises, is the hippopotamus. And ancient cetaceans went through phases that was much like modern day hippopotami. They lived in shallow, swampy environments. They were probably slow moving, a little bit cumbersome, and then over time they developed flukes, that big propulsive tail. They lost their forearms and they turned into flippers. Their hind limbs were lost altogether. It's a just absolutely fascinating story.
How do we know all that?
That's a great question. The fossil record. The fossil record. So there are all these intermediate forms that we found through skeletal morphology. So the very earliest cetacean ancestor is this group of animals known as Pachycetus. And it was a little sort of small dog-like creature that was terrestrial with 4 limbs. We link that to modern day cetaceans because it had ear bones that were adapted probably for underwater hearing. So despite the fact that it looks totally like a terrestrial animal, it did spend some time in water. And then, you fast forward through all these stages of, they're called archaeocetes, literally Latin for ancient whale. And there are a whole bunch of different lineages of those. And we can find lineages that have hind limbs where the articulation with the pelvic girdle is such that it's clear that the hind limb doesn't fall right below the body. It's stuck out behind. And that is an indication that they use their hind limbs for swimming more. There are lineages where the hind limbs become smaller and smaller, and finally the only thing that's left in modern day cetaceans, the hind limbs are gone altogether. The pelvic girdle is reduced to 2 free-floating bones that are just buried in that are buried in the abdominal cavity. So there are a lot of fossilized evidence of these lineages and that transition and the progression from those small terrestrial animals to modern day cetaceans. It's a fascinating story.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, and with that, I'm going to end my presentation, and thank you, Laurel, once again for inviting me to talk about one of my absolute favorite subjects.
Thank you, Lisa. And we have a couple questions already. Again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. The first question is about that seafloor spreading video. And what determined the rate of speed for the drifting continents?
Yes, well, so seafloor spreading is driven, it occurs because there are different plates, they call them continental plates, that are moving underneath molten magma deeper down in the earth. And the rate of movement varies depending on the plate. So without going into too much detail, what I will say is extraordinarily, on average, the rate of movement is about the same rate as the growth of your fingernail, which is astounding to me because this is actually geological change happening in a measurable way.
And who is the artist on the last photo that you showed? I think, is that the beginning of the PowerPoint? I can't tell.
That might be the Basilosauridae. And I am going to have to get back to you on that. The beauty of Google Images is that you can obtain a lot of these fascinating images, but not all of them are attributed to a particular species, and not all of them, amazingly enough, are attributed to an author. So I'll have to get back to you on that.
Definitely. And what point did the fossil record, at what point in the fossil record did whales and dolphins start using echolocation?
That's a great question. So cetaceans are very well known for their echolocation capabilities, their use of sound to obtain information from the water and from the environment around them. Sound travels faster and farther in water than it does in air by a long shot, even though we do have echolocating bats that use echolocation, that same sensory system in the air. But yes, one of the things that I was not able to talk about due to lack of time was the evolution of echolocation. And when the ancestors of cetaceans moved into the water, vision became a lot less important because of the characteristics of transmission of light through water versus air, and sound became a lot more important. It is the toothed whales that have the highly developed echolocation capabilities. And if you remember in the phylogeny of modern day cetaceans that I showed, toothed whales diverged from baleen whales about 35 million years ago. So it is from that point forward that echolocation started. So I mean, in terms of evolutionary time, it's still a relatively recent development, but it is extremely highly developed in the toothed whales, and the deeper diving species have the most highly developed because they are foraging at depth where essentially they're in complete darkness, no light at all.
That makes sense. They had to adapt. Fish tails are vertical and move left to right, but cetacean tails are horizontal and move up and down. Is the early animal ancestry the reason why?
Yes. Great observation. Yes, absolutely. Because cetaceans evolved from terrestrial animals that used to walk around with their four limbs. And as they moved back into the water, they had skeletons that moved up and down. And so that's the way that propulsive organ, the tail, developed in cetaceans, whereas in fish, they have never, ancestors never came out of the water. They initially evolved with their tails moving side to side. So it's a really interesting study in form and function. You know, the tails function essentially the same way to move the animal through the water, but the evolutionary history has made a big mark on whether the tails move side to side or up and down.
That's fascinating. Is your understanding that elephants are marine mammals whose ancestors returned to land? And if so, are elephant phylogenies intersecting with cetacean phylogenies?
Yeah, so my understanding is that elephants have always evolved from terrestrial ancestors. Of course, all of us, if you go back far enough, all terrestrial organisms did evolve from marine organisms. That's where life is believed to first have evolved. So all terrestrial life ultimately can be traced back to marine forms. And then it is certain terrestrial ancestors that re-entered the water and became these, what we call secondary marine forms. all marine mammals are secondary marine forms having evolved from terrestrial ancestors, as are seabirds and marine turtles, marine reptiles. But elephants, once their ancestors came out on land, are remained on land.
Great. And let's just see. There's so many fascinating questions. Any theories on the future of cetacean evolution, especially with humans impacting the species?
Yes. So that is a really great question. And I'm going to now move from evolutionary time to time spans that we experience in our own lifetimes. So the evolutionary story takes place in terms of millions of years. And it's really hard to conceptualize what a million is. It's just too big to be able to wrap your arms around it. It's just huge, hugely long, millions of years. Now, think about our lifetime, decades. And in our lifetimes, cetaceans are under some pretty critical threats. Without over dramatizing things, I will tell you that in 2007, we marine mammalogists declared one species of river dolphin, the Yangtze river dolphin, extinct. That dolphin was so distinct from other cetaceans that it represented an entire family of mammals, just that one species. And the last animal was seen alive in the year 2002. But an expedition throughout the world, the global range throughout the entire Yangtze River that did a visual and an acoustic survey for that species twice, failed to find any evidence of their existence. And so it's recognized to be extinct now. And it's extinct because of accidental impacts that humans have had on that Yangtze River.
Was it the dam? They had a dam in the Yangtze?
Well, yes, that's just one of many perturbations. Damming, overfishing, pollution, ship strikes. Let's see, about 15 years ago, I read a statistic that said 1/10 of the world's population lives in the Yangtze River Valley. So extraordinarily impacted by humans. And no one was after the Yangtze River dolphin. It just got accidentally killed in fishing gear. That's what drove it extinct. The same thing is happening to the vaquita, the tiny porpoise endemic to the northern Gulf of California in Mexico. It's critically endangered, the most endangered marine mammal on the planet now. We think if there are any left, probably 10 or less. Again, it's just accidentally being killed. It's being caught up in other human impacts that have nothing to do with that. So circling back to the question about my thoughts about the future evolution of cetaceans in the face of human impacts on the world oceans, I'm afraid that things look rather dire. If we leave cetaceans alone, they can recover. There are some extraordinary success stories associated with the protection of large whales after commercial whaling drove many of those populations, extirpated many of those populations. But if we leave them alone, they can recover. But we have to do that, and we have to maintain healthy ocean ecosystems.
I think that leaves it on a, good note of reflection for all of us. So thank you, Dr. Ballance. This has been extremely informative. We have a lot of comments saying how interesting this talk was and how much they enjoyed your scientific, explanations. So I want to thank you so much. We originally were going to have Dr. Ballance come in person to Bend, but unfortunately that was stymied. But we're so happy that Zoom exists and that we can get to see you talk today.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It was a pleasure.